There is a particular kind of silence that lives inside an abandoned house. It is not the silence of peace or rest. It is not the silence of a Sunday morning before the world wakes up. It is the silence of things unsaid, of secrets pressed into the walls like old newspapers stuffed behind insulation, of memories that have nowhere left to go. It is the silence of a life that was lived inside those rooms, loudly and fully, and sometimes painfully, and then one day simply stopped. That kind of silence has a weight to it, a presence. And if you have ever walked into a house where something terrible once happened, or where someone you loved once breathed and laughed and slept, you already know exactly what I am talking about. You feel it before you can name it. Some people turn around and walk back out. And some people, the brave ones, or maybe the broken ones, keep walking in. On a gray Thursday morning in the early spring of 2023, a man named Richard Hargrove pulled his car to a stop at the iron gate of a property he had not set foot on in 11 years. He sat behind the wheel for a long time before he got out. People who knew Richard well, and there were not many who could honestly say they did, described him as a man who had learned to carry his grief quietly. Not with grace exactly, but with the kind of stubborn dignity that some men wear like armor, because without it they are afraid of what might show through. He was 61 years old. His hair had gone silver at the temples. His hands, still strong, still steady, gripped the steering wheel like he was deciding something. Because he was. He was deciding whether to go inside. He was deciding whether he was ready. And the truth he would not admit to his attorney or his doctor or the woman he had been quietly seeing for 3 years in Atlanta, was that he was not sure he would ever be ready. But the mansion had to be sold. That was what his financial team had told him. And Richard Hargrove had not built a real estate empire from nothing by letting his feelings make his decisions for him. So he got out of the car. He pushed open the gate, and he walked toward the front door of the house where his wife Margaret had lived and laughed and disappeared, and, as far as Richard Hargrove and the entire state of Georgia had believed for 11 years, died. Before we go any further into this story, and I promise you we are going to go very far into it, before we get to what Richard found inside that house, before we get to the child at the top of the stairs and the letter on the kitchen counter and the woman who walked through the back door at dusk, I want to ask you something. I want you to think about the people you trust most in your life. The person whose word you would take without question. The person whose face, more than any other face in the world, you associate with the word home. Now I want you to ask yourself, how well do you really know them? How much of who they are have you actually seen? And how much have you simply assumed? Because the story of Richard and Margaret Hargrove is not, at its heart, a story about crime. It is a story about a marriage. About two people who loved each other, genuinely, deeply, in ways that people who knew them still talk about, and about what happens when love is not enough to keep the truth from breaking everything apart. This is a story about secrets, about debts and shame and desperation, and about the extraordinary lengths that ordinary people will go to when they feel they have run completely out of options. And before we go any further, I want to take a moment to say, wherever you are watching this right now, we would love to know. Drop a comment below and tell us what city or state you are watching from. We read every single one. And if you are new here and you want more stories like this one, real stories, told the way they deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss a single one of our upcoming videos. Now, let us go back to the beginning. Because to understand what Richard found inside that house in the spring of 2023, you have to understand who Richard and Margaret Hargrove were before everything fell apart. Richard Hargrove was born in 1962 in Macon, Georgia, the second of 3 sons born to a hardware store owner named Earl Hargrove and a former schoolteacher named Beverly. The Hargroves were not wealthy, but they were not poor either. They were the kind of family that paid their bills on time and kept their yard clean and showed up to church on Sunday not because they were particularly devout, but because that was what respectable people in Macon, Georgia did in 1970. Richard was, by all accounts, a sharp and restless child, the kind of boy who was always building something, always calculating something, always looking at an empty lot and seeing something that wasn't there yet. He played baseball through high school, studied civil engineering at the University of Georgia, and graduated in 1984 into a construction industry that was hungry for exactly his kind of mind. By 1987, at 25 years old, he had started his own small construction firm with a pickup truck, a business license, and a handshake loan from his father. By 1995, that firm had become Hargrove Development Group, with projects across 5 southeastern states. By 2001, Richard Hargrove was worth, conservatively, somewhere between $800 million and $1 billion. He was 40 years old, and he had built his empire himself, brick by brick, deal by deal, with the kind of relentless focus that left very little room for anything else, including, if we are being honest, his marriage. Margaret Elaine Calloway was 24 years old when she met Richard Hargrove at a charity gala in Atlanta in 1989. She had grown up in Savannah, the daughter of a Baptist minister and a woman who made the best peach preserves in 3 counties and never once let anyone forget it. Margaret had studied art history at Emory University and had spent 2 years working at a small gallery in Buckhead before a friend dragged her, protesting mildly, to a fundraiser for a children's hospital. Richard was there because one of his business partners had told him it was the kind of event a man in his position ought to be seen at. Margaret was there because she genuinely cared about sick children, which was the first thing about her that Richard could not stop thinking about. The second thing was her laugh. People who knew Margaret in those early years always mentioned her laugh. It was the kind of laugh that made you feel like you had said something more clever than you actually had. Richard Hargrove, a man who prided himself on not being easily impressed, was completely undone by it within 20 minutes of meeting her. They married in June of 1993 at a ceremony in Savannah that people in certain circles talked about for years afterward. And for a while, a good while, a real while, they were happy. But happiness, as anyone over a certain age will tell you, is not a destination. It is a condition. It requires maintenance. It requires attention. And Richard Hargrove, who gave his full and extraordinary attention to almost every other thing in his life, had a habit, a quiet, consistent, devastating habit, of letting the most important thing go unwatered. By 2000, the cracks in the Hargrove marriage were visible to anyone who cared to look closely. Richard was traveling more than he was home. The phone calls that used to last an hour had shortened to 10 minutes, then 5, then a quick text to say the flight was delayed and he would be in by midnight. Margaret, who had given up her career at the gallery when they married and devoted herself to running their household and their considerable charitable commitments, found herself increasingly alone inside a house that had 12 rooms and felt like it had 1,200. She confided in her oldest friend, a woman named Donna Pierce who had known her since the 3rd grade, that she felt like a photograph of herself, present in the room, but not quite real, not quite seen. Donna would later say that she had tried, more than once, to tell Richard that something was wrong, that Margaret was lonely in a way that had nothing to do with being alone. Richard listened. He nodded. He sent Margaret flowers. And then he went back to work, because that is what Richard knew how to do. Work was the one place where everything made sense, where problems had solutions and effort produced results, and the numbers always added up if you were smart enough and disciplined enough and willing to work long enough. The problem was that Margaret was not a problem with a solution. She was a person who needed to be truly, fully known. And Richard had stopped trying to know her sometime around 1998. He just had not realized it yet. Then came the financial crisis of 2008, and everything that had been quietly fraying began to tear in earnest. Richard had expanded aggressively through the mid-2000s, leveraging heavily to fund projects across Georgia, Florida, Tennessee, and the Carolinas. When the real estate market collapsed in 2008 with a speed and totality that almost nobody had genuinely prepared for, Richard's empire did not fall, but it bent, badly, under the weight of debt and frozen credit and projects that were half-built and suddenly worth half of nothing. He did not tell Margaret how bad it was. He told her things were difficult, which was the kind of word that men like Richard used to describe situations that are in fact catastrophic. He told her they might need to cut back on some expenses. He did not tell her that he had, in his desperation to keep the company alive, entered into a financial arrangement with a private investment group called Meridian Capital Holdings, a group that his attorney would later describe, in sealed depositions, as having connections to organized financial crime. Richard did not know the full extent of what Meridian was when he first signed with them. That is what his legal team would argue, and there is evidence to support that argument. But there came a point, a specific, documented point in the spring of 2010, when Richard knew. When the paper trail became clear enough that a man of his intelligence could no longer claim ignorance. And he made a choice. He stayed. He kept the money. He kept the arrangement. He told himself he would find a way to clean it up later, when the company was stable, when the worst was over. He told himself that a lot of things that had turned out not to be true. And Margaret found out. We do not know exactly when Margaret discovered the truth about Meridian Capital Holdings. What we know is that by the summer of 2010, she had consulted, quietly, and without Richard's knowledge, with an attorney in Athens, Georgia, a woman named Carol Simmons who specialized in financial and white-collar criminal matters. Carol Simmons would later confirm, in a statement given to investigators in 2023, that Margaret had come to her office with documents. Specific, detailed, damning documents. Bank records. Wire transfer confirmations. A trail that, if followed to its end, pointed directly at Richard's involvement in a money laundering operation that had moved, by conservative estimates, somewhere between $4 and $6 million through Hargrove Development Group's accounts over a period of 18 months. Margaret sat in Carol Simmons' office and asked her what would happen if this became public. Carol told her, Richard would face federal charges. The business would be seized. Their assets, the accounts, the properties, the investments, would be frozen, pending investigation. Everything they had built together, everything Margaret had given her adult life to supporting and sustaining, would be dismantled by the government, piece by piece, in full view of the public. Margaret left that office and drove home and sat in the garden behind the mansion for a long time. She was pregnant, 8 weeks along. She had not told Richard yet. She had found out 3 days before she found the documents. And now she sat in the garden she had planted herself, behind the house that bore her name on the deed alongside his, carrying a child that Richard did not yet know existed, and she made the first of the decisions that would change all of their lives forever. She did not go to the authorities, and she did not confront Richard directly. What Margaret Hargrove did, methodically, quietly, with the same careful deliberation she brought to everything she ever undertook, was begin to plan. She spent the better part of the next 18 months preparing for a disappearance so complete, so carefully constructed, that it would convince not just the police and the press and the public, but the man who had shared her bed for 17 years. She researched. She saved money, not from the joint accounts where Richard would notice, but from small personal accounts she had maintained since before their marriage, supplemented by careful, unremarkable cash transactions that drew no attention. She converted part of the mansion's upper east wing, a section that had been used for storage for years, accessible through a back corridor that Richard never used, into a livable space. She did this slowly, over many months, a few items at a time. A small refrigerator, a hot plate, bedding, books, a homeschool curriculum, purchased online from 3 different retailers over the course of a year. She installed solar panels on the rear outbuilding that fed a small off-grid electrical system, a project she told the contractor was for a guest cottage renovation she was planning as a surprise for Richard. The contractor thought nothing of it. Why would he? She was the lady of the house. She was Margaret Hargrove, and Margaret Hargrove had always been the most capable, composed, thoughtful woman in any room she entered. Nobody questioned her. Nobody looked twice. That was, perhaps, both her greatest strength and the thing that had made her feel most invisible for the last decade of her marriage. On the night of October the 14th, 2012, Margaret Hargrove's plan reached its moment of execution. Richard was in Atlanta, a business dinner that his calendar confirmed would keep him occupied until at least 11 o'clock that evening. The housekeeper, Rosa Mendez, left the property at 3:30 in the afternoon, as she always did on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Margaret made one phone call that evening, 4 minutes and 22 seconds, to a prepaid phone that investigators would spend weeks trying to trace and never fully succeed. She walked through the rooms of the mansion one last time, not sentimentally, or perhaps sentimentally, in a way she would never have allowed herself to show. She straightened a pillow on the living room sofa. She washed the one glass she had used that day and placed it back in the cabinet. She wrote a letter and placed it in an envelope on the kitchen counter with Richard's name on the front in her handwriting. And then she disabled the security system from the inside panel, walked through the back corridor, climbed the stairs to the east wing she had spent a year preparing, and closed the door behind her. She was 37 years old. She was 4 months pregnant, and she had made peace, in her own way, with what she was doing. She lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around her, and she waited. What happened next is both the most straightforward and the most heartbreaking part of this entire story. A woman's body was discovered 31 hours after Margaret's disappearance in a shallow ravine off Route 9, approximately 2.5 miles from the Hargrove estate. The woman had been dressed in clothing matching what Margaret had been wearing. She carried identification belonging to Margaret Hargrove. The medical examiner determined that the cause of death was consistent with a fall, blunt force trauma, and exposure. The body was significantly damaged, consistent with having been in the ravine for an extended period in cold, wet conditions. Richard Hargrove, devastated, identified the body as his wife's. The investigation moved quickly and concluded efficiently. Margaret Elaine Hargrove, age 37, was declared dead. An accidental fall. The letter she had left was reviewed by investigators and deemed a private matter, a personal communication between spouses, not relevant to a determination of accident versus intent. Margaret was buried on a cold Saturday in November 2012 in a private ceremony at the Callaway family plot in Savannah, Georgia. 300 people attended. Richard stood at the graveside and did not cry, not because he was not destroyed, but because he was the kind of man who understood, at some fundamental level, that if he started, he might not be able to stop. He sealed the mansion the following week. He moved into a hotel. He went back to work because it was the only place he knew how to be. And the house with its secret east wing and its off-grid solar system and its false-backed wardrobe and the woman living quietly behind it, sat silent and waited. Now here is the thing about secrets. The thing that the people who keep them never fully account for, no matter how intelligent they are, no matter how carefully they plan. Secrets require maintenance. They require the ongoing cooperation of the universe, and the universe, as it turns out, is not particularly cooperative. Margaret Hargrove had planned for almost everything. She had planned for the practical realities of living hidden inside a large property. The food, the power, the water drawn from a secondary line she had rerouted to the east wing before her disappearance. She had planned for her pregnancy, arranging through a network of carefully maintained anonymity to have a midwife attend the birth, a woman who, to her lasting credit, honored the confidence placed in her and remained silent for over a decade. She had planned for her son's education, which she took entirely upon herself, and which she executed with the thoroughness and dedication that had characterized everything she had ever done. The boy she named Thomas Richard Hargrove, though only she knew the middle name she had given him, grew up inside those walls knowing, in the way that children know things they have been carefully taught, that his world was the East Wing, and the books, and the lessons, and his mother. He knew his father's name. He had seen photographs. He had been told, with the calm and loving honesty that Margaret brought to even the hardest conversations, that one day his father would come, and that when he came, Thomas should not be afraid. What Margaret had not fully planned for was 11 years. She had imagined, in that garden in the summer of 2010, that this would be a matter of years, not a decade. That Richard's arrangement with Meridian Capital Holdings would eventually surface on its own, through a federal investigation, through a whistleblower, through the ordinary inevitable consequences of doing wrong things in a world that tends, eventually, to catch up with you. She had imagined that she would emerge from hiding into a world where Richard had already faced his reckoning, and they could have the conversation that needed to be had. And then, she did not know exactly what came after then. But she had hoped. She had always hoped. And then, 11 years later, Richard came home. Not because of a federal investigation. Not because the truth about Meridian had finally surfaced. He came home because the mansion needed to be sold, and his financial team had told him so, and Richard Hargrove had always, in the end, done what needed to be done. He pushed open the front door of his sealed house on a gray Thursday morning in the spring of 2023, and he walked inside. The foyer was exactly as he had left it. 11 years of dust on the chandelier. The grandfather clock stopped at 12:08, the exact minute he had come home on the night he found the envelope and the empty bedroom and the life he had believed was his already gone. The air should have smelled like abandonment, like mold and cold in time. Instead, it smelled of something warm, something lived in, something that did not belong in a house that had been sealed for 11 years. Richard stood in the foyer and felt the hair rise on the back of his neck in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. And then, from above him, He heard a footstep on the hardwood floor of the upper hallway. One footstep. Small. Deliberate. The footstep of a child. Richard Hargrove stood at the base of his own staircase and did not move for what he would later describe as the longest 30 seconds of his 61 years on this earth. And then he called out. His voice, trained by decades of boardrooms and negotiations and hard conversations, did not shake. But it came out quieter than he expected. The word he chose was simply hello. And the door at the top of the stairs opened. And a boy stepped out into the light and looked down at him. Dark hair. Quiet, steady eyes that Richard would recognize, later, from every mirror he had ever looked into. The boy was perhaps 10 or 11 years old. He was calm in a way that suggested he had been prepared for exactly this moment. And he looked at Richard Hargrove, this stranger, this enormous fact, this man who was his father, and he said 4 words. He said, "She said you'd come." Richard did not call the police. He has explained this decision, privately and in legal proceedings, in several different ways at several different times. But the most honest version of his explanation, the one his attorney James Whitfield says Richard gave him that night on the phone, his voice barely above a whisper, was simply this. He said, "James, I think she's here." Not was. Not had been. Is. Richard Hargrove had identified 17 bodies in his professional life. Collapses, accidents, the brutal calculus of a construction empire operating across decades and multiple states. He had identified 1 body in his personal life. He had identified his wife's body in a county medical examiner's office in November of 2012, and he had signed the form and driven home and sealed a house and spent 11 years carrying what he believed was the truth of that afternoon. And now he was standing at the base of a staircase looking at a child with his own eyes and his wife's mouth. And the child had spoken in the calm, unhurried voice of someone who had been told not to worry, that this day would come. Richard sat down on the floor of the foyer. This billionaire, this man who had faced down banks and bondholders and a financial crisis that had broken lesser men. And he sat on the dusty marble floor of his sealed house, and he waited. He waited because the boy had said she said you'd come. Present tense. Said. Not said before she died. Not said when she was alive. Said. As in recently. As in she is somewhere, and she is saying things, and she will be back. Margaret Hargrove came home at 6:47 in the evening. She came in through the back service road, a path invisible from the main gate, accessible only to someone who knew the property as well as a person who had lived on it for years. She had gone, as she did several times a month, to collect supplies, food, books, household items, from stores in towns far enough away that no one would connect her face to the name of a woman declared dead 11 years ago. She had colored her hair darker. She wore glasses she did not need. She had, in the careful and exhausting way of someone who has been hiding for over a decade, become very good at being almost invisible. She parked the car and walked toward the house and saw, through the kitchen window, the light on in the foyer. And she stopped. And then she kept walking. Because the light meant he was here. And the letter she had left on the counter 11 years ago had said, "I will be in our home. Waiting. But only if you can answer one question honestly when you finally find us." Margaret Hargrove pushed open the back door of the house, where she had lived her hidden life for 11 years, and walked into the kitchen and found her husband sitting at the table with their son. Richard looked at her across 11 years and one kitchen table, and he did not speak for a long time. And then he said one word. He said her name. The conversation that followed lasted for most of that night. Thomas went upstairs at some point. Whether he slept or simply gave them space, he has never said publicly. Richard and Margaret sat at that kitchen table until the sun began to come up over the property, talking in the way that 2 people talk when they have 11 years of silence to fill and no guarantee that the other person will still be there when the silence is over. Margaret told Richard everything. She told him about the documents she had found. She told him about her conversation with Carol Simmons. She told him about the decision she had made in the garden in the summer of 2010 and the 18 months of preparation that followed. She told him about the East Wing and the solar panels and the midwife and the day Thomas was born in a room 50 feet above the kitchen where Richard was now sitting. She told him she had never stopped loving him. She told him that loving someone and being able to live with them were 2 different things, and that she had needed to know. She had needed to know if the man she had married was still inside the man he had become. She told him that the question she had written in the letter 11 years ago was still the question. She looked at him across the table, with the same steady directness that had made people trust her their entire lives, and she asked him, "Do you know what you did? And are you sorry?" Richard Hargrove looked at his wife, the woman he had buried, the woman who had been alive and present in his own house for 11 years, the woman who had raised his son alone in a hidden room while he went back to work and tried to outrun his grief, and he answered. He said, "Yes, I know what I did, and I have spent 11 years being sorry. I just did not know what I was sorry for." The legal consequences of what followed were significant, complicated, and in some ways remarkable. Margaret's reappearance created immediate and serious questions for law enforcement and the courts. The woman found in the ravine in October 2012 had been identified as Margaret Hargrove by Richard, and the case had been closed as accidental death. Reopening it required establishing the true identity of the deceased, a process that involved DNA analysis and a careful, painstaking investigation that ultimately confirmed what Margaret had written in her letter. The woman had died before Margaret encountered her, an accidental death in a remote area, a Jane Doe whose body Margaret had discovered on the night of her disappearance while traveling through those woods, and whose tragic circumstances Margaret had, in her desperation and her grief and her impossible situation, used to create the appearance of her own death. Margaret had not caused that woman's death. The medical and forensic evidence confirmed it, but she had used it, and that fact alone occupied legal proceedings for the better part of 2 years. In the end, prosecutors in Fulton County, Georgia, after lengthy deliberation and in consultation with the original investigators, declined to file charges against Margaret. The reasoning was complex and contested and generated significant debate in legal circles. But the core of it was this, that the misidentification had been Richard's, not Margaret's fabrication, and that Margaret's actions, while extraordinary and legally ambiguous, had caused no direct measurable harm to the administration of justice in the matter that had actually been investigated. Richard, critically, refused to cooperate with any potential prosecution of his wife. He stated this clearly, directly, and on the record, and he did not waver from it. Richard's own legal situation was a different matter entirely, and Richard knew it. The Meridian Capital Holdings arrangement had never been investigated, never surfaced, never produced consequences, because Margaret had chosen not to go to the authorities in 2010, and because the arrangement had been structured carefully enough to avoid casual detection. But Richard had carried the knowledge of it for 13 years. And the arrival of his wife, alive, with documentation, with memory, with the quiet moral certainty that had always been Margaret's most formidable quality, made continuing to carry it alone both impossible and, Richard would say, unbearable. In the summer of 2023, Richard Hargrove, acting through his attorney James Whitfield, and in full voluntary cooperation with the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Georgia, self-reported his involvement in the Meridian Capital Holdings scheme. He provided documents, testimony, and full cooperation with the subsequent investigation. He did not minimize his role. He did not hide behind the argument that he had not fully known, at the beginning, what Meridian was, though that argument was available to him and might have served him well. He told the truth, the complete truth, because Margaret had asked him, across a kitchen table in the dark of the night that changed everything, whether he was truly sorry. And this was what being truly sorry looked like. In exchange for his full cooperation, Richard received a sentence of 3 years federal probation, substantial financial penalties, and the permanent dissolution of 3 of his largest holding companies. His fortune, which had rebuilt itself significantly since the crisis of 2008 and had stood at an estimated $900 million at the time of his self-reporting, was reduced by the penalties and the resulting business restructuring to somewhere in the range of $400 million. Richard Hargrove, by every measure, did not seem to mind. The people around him, his attorney, his accountant, the small circle of associates who knew any part of what had happened, uniformly reported the same thing, that he seemed lighter, that he seemed, for the first time in the 11 years any of them had known him, like a man who was not carrying something he could barely lift. Thomas Hargrove was 13 years old by the time the legal proceedings were largely resolved. He had spent his entire life inside the walls of an estate that the outside world believed was empty, educated by a woman of extraordinary intellect and patience, surrounded by books and music and the careful, loving attention of a mother who had given up everything to protect him. He enrolled in a school in Atlanta in the fall of 2024, a small private school where the administration had been briefed, in confidence, on some portion of his unusual history. His teachers described him as remarkable, thoughtful beyond his years, possessed of an almost preternatural composure. He had, they said, his mother's ability to make you feel seen, and his father's stubborn refusal to be stopped by anything. Richard did not sell the mansion. He has been asked about this decision in the only interview he has given, a brief, careful conversation with a Georgia newspaper reporter in the spring of 2024, the contents of which were subsequently widely reported. He said, "I left that house because I thought everything I loved had gone from it. But it turned out that everything I loved had been there the whole time." He said he intended to remove every lock from every door in the property during the renovation. He said there had been enough hiding in that place. Margaret has not given any interviews. She has said, through Richard's attorney, that she has nothing to add to what is already known, and that her family, she used the word deliberately, pointedly, with full knowledge of everything it implied, deserved privacy. Donna Pierce, her childhood friend, confirmed in a single public statement that she had been in sporadic contact with Margaret throughout the years of her disappearance, and that Margaret's well-being and the well-being of her son had always been her primary concern. She declined all further comment. The renovation of the Hargrove estate is ongoing. Workers have been seen at the property on and off for most of the past year. The iron gate, which was rusted closed for 11 years, has been rehung and moves freely now. Neighbors report that lights are on in the house on most evenings. Someone has planted flowers along the front walk. They are, by all accounts, very well tended. There is something that stays with me about this story, something that I keep returning to, no matter how many times I turn it over and look at it from different angles. It is not the deception, extraordinary as that deception was. It is not the legal questions, which were genuinely complex and genuinely unresolved in ways that legal scholars are still debating. It is not even the revelation. The moment of the child at the top of the stairs, the footstep in the empty house, the woman walking through the back door at dusk. What stays with me is the letter. The letter Margaret left on the kitchen counter on the night she disappeared, with Richard's name on the front in her handwriting. The letter that investigators reviewed and deemed a private matter. The letter whose contents we know only through the accounts of those involved. Accounts that may not be complete, that may have been shaped by memory and time, and the very human need to make sense of impossible things. The letter that said, in its essential core, "I will be here. I will be waiting. But only if you can tell me honestly that you know what you did, and that you are sorry for it." Margaret Hargrove, a woman who had every reason, by any ordinary measure, to simply leave, chose instead to wait. In the house, in the walls of the life they had built together, behind a false-backed wardrobe in an east wing that nobody used. She waited 11 years for the man she loved to come home and answer the question honestly. And when he came, and when he answered, she stayed. Not because she had to, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because the answer, after 11 years and everything they had both survived, was finally the right one. Was it the right choice? Was it justice? For her, for Thomas, for Richard, for the woman in the ravine whose identity and story deserved better than to be borrowed by someone else's plan? Those are questions I cannot answer for you. Those are questions that reasonable people, thoughtful, compassionate, good people, will answer differently depending on what they believe about marriage and obligation and forgiveness and the things that love can and cannot excuse. What I can tell you is that the mansion has flowers along the front walk now, and that the lights are on in the evenings, and that a boy named Thomas Hargrove, 13 years old, is sitting in a classroom in Atlanta learning alongside other children his age for the very first time, and that whatever any of us might think about the choices that brought him there, he is, by the accounts of every person who has encountered him, doing beautifully. And I think about Margaret, sitting in that garden in 2010, carrying a secret and a child and an impossible decision, looking at the house that held her marriage and asking herself what she owed to the truth and what she owed to love, and whether those two things could ever, in the end, be made to point in the same direction. I think she would say that the answer, for her, turned out to be yes. That it just took 11 years, and an iron gate with new hinges, and a boy who grew up knowing his father would come. I wonder what you think. Drop it in the comments. I want to know. Was Margaret right to wait? Was Richard's honesty enough? And what do you think you would have done if you had been the one sitting at that kitchen table in the dark, with 11 years between you and a single question still hanging in the air? If this story moved you in any way, please hit the like button. It takes 1 second, and it genuinely helps more people find stories like this one. And if you are not subscribed yet, please consider it, because next week we are bringing you a story that in some ways is even harder to believe than this one. The story of a woman who entered witness protection and the daughter who spent 20 years searching for her, never knowing that her mother had been watching over her from a distance the entire time. We will see you then.